the pursuit of sin is the pursuit of death. This is the main point that James begins to stab here. The pursuit of sin is the pursuit of death. Like, after looking at where our sin really stems from, James begins to walk us through the progression of the anatomy of sin. It's the tying lure of sorts. Look at verse 15. He says this. So verse 14, you're tempted and lured with your own desire. Verse 15, then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So there's a progression here, right? And so the progression essentially is deception, which leads you to desire, which leads you to disobedience, which leads you to death. All right, I'm going to frame these out for you real quick. All right, deception. You begin to believe that God is not good, or you begin to believe a skewed version of who God is and what God does. That's deception. Then your deception leads you to a desire for something that's not of God. Your heart says, if I can't trust God here, can I trust God there? Excuse me. So your deception leads you to a desire for something that's anti-God or against God or something rooted not in God. That desire then will lead you to steps of disobedience. That desire then leads you towards little steps of disobeying God, little steps here, little things there. Then it becomes larger things here, and then larger things there. And pretty soon our entire continent is completely anti the Lord and anti-gospel, that we begin to pursue the lanes of death. And when James writes this, there's kind of a double meaning here. And he's talking about, yes, a spiritual death, but there's also some sins that will lead you in your own disobedience to a physical death, right? Or the consequence of those sins becomes a literal death. And so we always think, for some reason, we are stupid people. We always think that our sin will end well. It doesn't. We think that it's manageable. It's not. We think it'll provide us with something that we might want. It will for a season, until your sin says, hey, I give you this. Come here, let me show you something else. And you go, okay. Y'all laugh, like that's what we do. We go, okay. It's like guys, when we find a really attractive girl, and she's like, come here, we're like, okay, this looks good, right? That's exactly what this picture is. But here's the thing. Like, as I was researching verse 15, the picture that James uses is a lot worse. Like, since we want to take sin seriously, which we often don't, we need to open our eyes, which we don't want to do, right? The sin progression that James is actually using is a spiritually graphic picture of what a stillborn baby ends up being. All right? It has everything resembling life, but at the point of delivery, all of our worst fears come true. Like, it's a reality. Look, this reality, I'm talking about stillborns and stuff like that, like even from my own immediate family, it doesn't stem that far away. And so we all go from like this excitement of what is to be to the horrifying reality of what never will be, and it becomes simply a future memory of what could have been. And so we have to understand, again, to quote John Owen again, sin is like the grave that is never satisfied. And if sin leads you to death, that casket of sin and death, man, you have an enemy who wants as many people in that death with him. And the danger for us is for all of you, I've had to preach this to myself, so I can say you on this, right? Are you 1 foot in the grave? That's a question that you have to wrestle with. Are you kind of like, I'm halfway there, and you can feel that. Like, you can just feel like this tearing disconnect between what you want your life to be, or your own desire, versus what God is calling you to. If you're a believer and you feel that wrestling and that tension, that's a beautiful thing. Because it is you and the Spirit within you fighting against wickedness. So verse 16 says, "Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. So that very picture of that stillborn, which leads your sin leading to death, that is the reason why James tells you, do not be deceived. Do not be deceived by the deceitfulness of sin. Like, we as a church, collective, not just Bethel, but collectively, the church, we need to begin to take sin a lot more seriously than we actually do. Like, don't be deceived. You know what the biggest deceit in our churches are? It's not that bad. It's not that bad. You're still forgiven, which you are, but you hear me, like, there's a difference between, like, living in a forgiven life in a redemptive state of the gospel with Jesus versus being someone who's like, well, I like God, but I'm going to keep on pursuing what I want. Until the point where I feel the death, until I've had enough, well, at that point, you're too far gone. And there's a terrifying thing in your heart, and I've talked to friends about this who once were following Jesus, who no longer follow Jesus. They can tell you, I really sensed in my heart when I just kind of had that disconnect. I was like, I don't care anymore. That's terrifying. Terrifying. And so James is writing, guard yourself. Guard your heart. Sin looks enticing for a reason, but it will lead you to death. And there's a reason why Paul writes in Romans 7, for I know nothing good comes living in me. That is my flesh. So the question is, if I'm so filled with sin, Andy, what's my hope? If I'm such a totally depraved wretch, what's my hope? What's the point? If God can't even be in my presence because I'm a stinking, snotty little sinner, what gives? Verse 17, every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is, look, no variation and no shadow due to change. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So James goes from don't be deceived, don't be led astray by lies, to every good gift comes from God. This is how you'll know, he says. Don't be deceived. Good things, every good thing comes from God, which means the temptations we are facing are not from God. So